So let's look at a little bit about how to put content in. And this is the point where we start to get interactive. So the first thing is first, if you don't already have a Wikimedia account, I'm going to ask you to create one. You can either use your real name if you prefer to do everything under your real name, or you can use a pseudonym. I signed up with the pseudonym Evolution and Evolvability, and I edited anonymously for about a month before I decided, oh, you know what, it's going to be obvious, the sorts of topics I'm editing, it's going to be obvious that it's me anyway. There's only so many people who care about the directed evolution of tobacco H virus protease. So I then just stuck my name up in my user page, but my username is still officially Evolution and Evolvability. You have the option to include an email address. I strongly encourage you to do this. The email address will not be made public, but what it does do is it provides a form where people can contact you to ask you questions or to suggest things through email, even though your email address is not publicly visible. It also, I found it really useful with Wikipedia editors. Let's say someone who has been editing the Wikipedia page on, I don't know, Klinefelter's syndrome. If they've not edited for 5 years and they've kind of gone dark, and I want to contact them and say, hi, by the way, I noticed that there were some errors in this page. I've gone in to fix them, but if you know of any better information sources on this particular aspect, you know, just to let you know, it would be really useful if you could take another look at it.
What URL do you want us to go to?
Yep, I shall stick the URL in the Zoom chat now, actually. The other useful thing to know is that it's the same login for Wikidata, Wikipedia, Wikiversity, anything under the Wikimedia Foundation umbrella. So I'll copy link address and paste into Zoom chat. Where are we? There we go. Note, if you already have a Wikimedia account, this should just send you to a login page rather than a new account creation page. But if you are currently logged into a different Wikimedia account, it'll actually ask you explicitly, I think that you already are logged in under an account. Why are you trying to create a new account? Give me a reason. Because you're not allowed to have multiple different wiki accounts. It's called sock puppeting unless you have one of a short list of reasons. So for example, if you are in some paid wiki editing position, like a Wikipedian in residence or something like that, then you're meant to set up a separate wiki account. But in general, it's encouraged that you just have the one wiki account for doing everything. Additionally, you're not meant to have multiple people editing using the same account name. It's meant to be one person, one account. So for example, you couldn't have an account called the Youngstrom Lab that everyone from Eric's group uses interchangeably. You're meant to have one person, one account. So I'm going to put this, I just need to quickly change which screen I'm sharing on so that I can share two things on the same screen at once.
I've been looking for some examples on the web, but what I've seen some people describe with Sparkle is instead of building tables like a traditional database, it's actually building a map, like a mind map. So you're adding objects and modifiers to the objects, and then showing connections between the objects. So like the Steve Evans object is connected to the Eric Youngstrom object by supervised during internship.
Mm-hmm.
And then also some publications would be shared between the two of us. And Matt Fritz, the Matt Fritz object is connected to the Eric Youngstrom object by both are connected to Division 5 of the American Psychological Association by the member category and the board category.
Is there a smoke alarm going off?
Yeah, I hear some beeping somewhere.
That's probably in my room. I don't see what's coming from that. Oop, it just stopped.
All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up a web page on one half of my screen, and I'm going to try and do the presentation on the other half of my screen, and we'll see see whether I can get that to work. For some reason, I am really struggling to get it to actually present on my primary monitor. Let's try that again. Ah, perfect. All right. Go back to Zoom, share screen, screen 1, share. All right, champion. So what I'm going to get us to do now that we've signed in is to just do a simple example of manually editing an item. So this is going to be an example where we're going to find some PhD theses that don't list their main topics. We are going to go to the URL for that thesis, and then we are going to add some statements about the topic of that thesis. The reason thesis is quite a useful example is because they're currently not particularly well annotated on Wikidata, because there was no automated way of doing it when the initial ones were put on. So there's still quite a few that don't list a main subject at all. So I'm going to recommend you to go to this site, w.wiki/p_CR. And what that will get us to is actually a live query of Wikidata as it currently exists. That lists all of these different theses, and it'll give you the Q number for it. It'll give you the title of the thesis. It'll give you the topic of the thesis, which should be blank because we're specifically searching for ones that don't have a stated topic, and then the URL of that thesis. I'm going to recommend just scrolling down to a random one some way partway down the list, so that we get different ones. So I'm going to look at this one about salinization. So I'll open up the Wikidata item in one tab, and I'll open up the URL for the thesis text itself in another tab. So here's an example Wikidata item, and as I mentioned, it's got a Q something or other, and it's an example of a doctoral thesis. So you can see that this is an instance of a doctoral thesis. It has this particular title, and it's even told me that this title is in Spanish. Now it's given me the English translation of that title. It's given me the author name. It tells me where this dissertation was submitted to, the date it was published, the copyright license that it's under, and the full URL. The full work is available at this URL that I've mentioned over here, which is where I'm going to get that information from. And it's also got a DOI. Excellent. That's all the information it's currently got. So it doesn't have a main subject currently. So what we're going to do is you'll notice that there are these edit buttons all the way down, which is exactly how Wikipedia works as well. So I can either edit an existing statement or I can add a new statement. And the way that these statements work is I'm going to be asked what's the property that I want to talk about and what's the value that I want to say is attached to that property. So in this case, I'm going to say, well, I'm going to add the statement, and the statement in this case is going to be main subject. Yep, here's the main subject, the primary topic of this work. And let's see if a main subject is actually listed on the web page URL for this article. So sometimes it'll list that kind of metadata down at the bottom. So we know the advisor and the co-advisor, we know the date, we know the degree, but I cannot see any information. Oh, subject, agrarian science. Okay, well, that's fine. So let's, for a start, we will use agrarian science, lowercase s. Okay, yep, agrarian science. Perfect, so I shall publish that. And I'm also going to add a reference for it. It's not enough to just say agrarian science because I say so. Well, what's my reference for it? Well, I'm going to say that my reference URL, where I got this information from, is this URL here. Whoops, I'm going to have to make my screen slightly wider, otherwise this all gets bunched up. So here we go, you can see reference URL, here's the URL. Yes, I would like to publish that change. So I've now got the situation where I've said, yep, the main subject of this article is agrarian science. And where's that information coming from? Well, it's referenced from here. But I'm also going to say something else because actually I can be a bit more specific. I'm going to say that one of the main topics of this work is salinization, right? Like we can be a bit more specific. So I'm going to say additionally, another main subject is the concept of salinization.
Can you use the keywords as the main subject, but add all the keywords as the main subject?
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, you can, so often I would say something of the order of like 4 to 8 main subjects is reasonable for an art, for something to have. So I'm just going to quickly find why there's no, so when I search for salinization here, it's coming up with a whole load of scientific articles about salinization. And it's coming up with a disambiguation page, but it's not coming up with salinization, the concept as I'm recognizing it. So I'm just going to quickly go through to this disambiguation page and see why I'm not coming across salinization and whether there's a different word for it that I'm not seeing. Yeah, I mean, salinity is probably the closest topic, but I'm surprised that there isn't an existing item for salinization as a process. For the moment, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say soil salinity. Oh, soil salinization. Yes, that's pretty clearly what I meant. So I'm just going to quickly go to that and say another also, soil salinization as a concept is also known as just salinization. It's not an unreasonable statement. And that means that when I search for it, I will actually find salinization, the thing that I'm expecting.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, go for it.
If the article, thank you, if the article that or the thesis I'm looking at isn't translated into English, but I speak Spanish, am I at liberty to translate simple phrases?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, there's one thing that you can definitely do in multiple languages, which is right up at the top, there's this label, which is kind of the main way in which this is known, right? So if it's a person, it'll be the name by which people know that person. If it's a thesis, it'll be the title of that thesis. And you'll notice that this has been entered in Spanish and it's been entered in English because it was obviously originally in an article, a thesis in Spanish, but no one has yet translated it into Chinese. If you speak any languages in addition to English, it is always very useful to have these labels translated into multiple languages.
A follow-up question, I think you were kind of getting at this, but when we are putting in our main subject and what I'm seeing is like there's multiple options for me to choose here, And so I'm tasked with choosing between like neurofibromatosis type 2, which is a scientific article, and then one that has the name, and then under it says type of neurofibromatosis disease, and one that just says human diseases, and then in parentheses it has the specific one. And so what I'm looking at, that what is it, what does it mean, is in the parentheses mean that's like a sub part of that article, or and then the part under it is like not in bold? What is that part?
Yeah, so I'll tell you what, I'll give let's think of an example that should work quite well. Resistance. Let's see if resistance is going to work. Yeah, so there's going to be, so when you look up a topic in Wikidata, what there will usually be is the bold one, which is that label, and then in non-bold is a description that's meant to disambiguate it from other versions of the same thing. So if I'm talking about resistance, do I mean resistance, the oppositional behavior, which is what I meant in this case, or do I mean resistance, the episode of Star Trek, or do I mean, I'm sure that there will be resistance, here is some academic article that is just titled resistance. And there should be, you know, all sorts of different things. There's a resistance in ecology, the property of communities to remain essentially unchanging. So what it'll try and do is give you all of these different versions, different disambiguations of the same concept. And sometimes something might not come up if it doesn't have a Wikidata item about it at all. So I don't know, like negative countertransference or something like that. I suspect that there probably isn't yet a Wikidata item about negative countertransference. There probably is one about countertransference.
Yeah, there is. Or there's 2 R's that you put there. That's why I didn't.
That might be it. And
R.
I put 2 R's there. So
I thought I read something recently.
Interesting. Have I completely misspelt it? Either way,
yeah.
So,
but I guess like the thing that I'm struggling with is that all of these.
Yeah.
There it is.
So one of the issues is that there will be a lot of items that are simply listed as scientific article, because you might be saying that the main subject of this thesis is not the concept of countertransference, but this is an entire thesis that is discussing this specific article. So for example, it might be the case that I wrote an entire thesis about Darwin's Origin of Species, not talking about origin of species, the concept of speciation, but specifically talking about the book written by Darwin and its historical significance, in which case the main subject of this thesis would be the origin of species, Darwin's book, not speciation, the concept in biology.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and that was, yeah, that answered my question.
Because one of the things that we could add, if we were so inclined, is add the statement cites work. And we can say this thesis cites salinization, this particular scientific article, salinity tolerance in halophytes. And we could do that for the probably 300 odd citations in this. And that's a project that is currently ongoing in a more automated fashion to, again, make a full open citation network that will rival Web of Science, but be open rather than proprietary. The other thing I'm going to note with this is that I've said here the main subject is soil salinization, and it is not actually stated anywhere here in this article's metadata that that's a main subject of this work. So I'm going to explicitly say here that my reference from this is actually based on a heuristic, and in this case, I'm basing it on the inference from the title . From the title.
Another question about this. I'm noticing a piece of information that's actually wrong. This document is labeled as a doctoral thesis, but it's a master's thesis. Do I have to do anything special if I change that?
No, so you don't need to do anything special when you change it. You have a couple of options that you can do in addition. So the first thing is there'll be a discussion page for every item, and this is true on any wiki, whether we're talking about Wikipedia, wiki journals, Wikiversity, whatever. There's a discussion page, and you can add a note in there of, by the way, this information was wrong and I've updated it. Particularly if you think that it might be contentious in any way, the update that you're making, it's worthwhile making a note on the discussion page. For something where it's clearly like it was written as it was indicated as a doctoral thesis, but it's definitely a master's thesis, I don't think you need to make any additional note. But if, for example, this article had previously written, the main subject was, I don't know, salinization, but they'd linked accidentally, instead of soil salinization, they'd linked to river salinization. And I wanted to say, look, really, it's this, I've read the abstract, I've read the title, it really doesn't mention river salinization at any point in this. I think that was a mistake. I'm changing it to soil salinization. I might want to put a note on the discussion page just to say, look, this is the reason why I've made that change.
Gotcha, thank you.
So hopefully that's a useful kind of starting example.
And you said that if it doesn't pop up, then just don't add it, even if a scientific article pops up and it's not what it's referencing?
Yeah, correct. So if you're searching for a term and it doesn't pop up, you've only got scientific articles. The useful thing is it is very easy to create a new Wikidata item. So let's say I wanted to make a Wikidata item for salinization in general and say that soil salinization is one facet of salinization, but there's also river salinization, and there's also, I don't know, other types of salinization. This is really outside my area, so I don't particularly know, but up in the top left corner, there is create a new item. And it's very easy to create a new item. And in fact, this is particularly common when we're talking about people. So let's just quickly see if this person has done anything since they published their PhD thesis in 2019. So they probably haven't published anything else, but there's always the possibility that they have. This might be the same person. Just going to quickly check that this is the same person, and then I'm going to see if this article is also in Wikidata. Okay, yeah, so this does look like it's the same person. Repository, and possibly an actual publication in a journal here. Yeah. All right, cool. So let's see if there's a Wikidata item on this yet. There currently isn't, that's a pity. Let's see if there's any other examples where he has published something that is in Wikidata, so I can just use that as an example. I think he might end up being the only time. Never mind.
Is it wrong if, like, let's say I'm Eric and I start adding Wikidata for my articles? Is that bad?
So this is an interesting one. In Wikipedia, there is a very strong tendency to want people to not edit anything that they are connected to. So not editing, Eric shouldn't be editing his own biography. His students ideally shouldn't be editing his biography. Instead, they should be making suggestions on the talk page, and it should be someone unconnected with him. And that is partly because of Wikipedia's history, where in its early days, there weren't sourcing requirements. So there weren't requirements to include references. One of the things with Wikidata is there's an increasingly strong emphasis on making sure that there's references for all this information. So if I were to go on to Eric's Wikidata item, so let's just go Eric Youngstrom, there's actually a number of issues with this currently where we don't have references for some of the information, particularly, I think, doctoral supervisor. Oh, yeah, occupation psychologist. I mean, anyone could have written that. Maybe he's not a psychologist. What if I also say that he's a psychic? Right? Well, if I wanted to state that Eric is a person who claims to use extrasensory perception to identify information hidden from the something, if I wanted to say he's a psychic, I should have a bloody good reference to state that he's a psychic.
I knew you were going to say that, though.
Yeah, maybe a faculty webpage, or maybe a news article, or maybe an interview on television where he claims psychic powers. And in fact, the fact that he's a psychologist, I should
Can you do a qualifier for psychologist, like put clinical psychologist?
In fact, that's yep, I can do that. So I can do a few different things. I could even say start and end time. So for example, if he used to be a child actor, but is no longer an actor and is now a psychologist, we can put occupation child actor from date X to date Y and psychologist from date Y onwards. But yeah, we can actually say we can say they're a psychologist of some subspeciality. We can say they are a psychologist. What other qualifiers might make sense for an occupation? I can't actually think of another one that is probably useful for occupations, but yeah, so we can put in subfields using the of qualifier.
Is clinical one of the qualifiers, or you might have
yes to... clinical, so field of work is already clinical psychology. I suspect that we could probably also there are other specific fields of work,
like you could put in like bipolar disorder and stuff,
like child psychology, like bipolar psychology. You can also combine them. So for example, is the field of work both child psychology and bipolar disorder, or is it specifically the clinical psychology of bipolar disorder? So you can start adding kind of qualifiers like that. So child and adolescent psychiatry, or child psychology.
That one.
Sorry?
That one.
That one.
I don't want to get in trouble for people thinking I said that I had an MD.
Yep. Yeah. So child psychology, and is it child psychology in general, or is it child psychology of bipolar disorder?
General.
Yeah, so in Wikipedia, self-published sources, which include things like faculty pages, can only be used to support what's called non-contentious information. So for example, the fact that Eric is a psychologist is not particularly controversial information. So I'm just going to cancel my edit of that. So I'll just add the reference URL here. But if I was going to say in Wikipedia, for example, Eric Youngstrom is the most famous psychologist in America working today, I couldn't use Eric's faculty page where he says, I'm the most famous psychologist in America, right? Or things like that. So for contentious information, faculty pages shouldn't be used in Wikipedia. But pretty much all of the information that is on Wikidata comes under that non-contentious category. We're not particularly saying anything that is contentious here. But if I was going to say psychic or something like that, particularly if people were to disagree. So for example, if Eric is completely convinced, I am not a psychic, I've never said I'm a psychic, but I do have a side business doing psychic readings and strongly imply that I'm a psychic to people who are paying me. And there's been this big scandal in the news, and it's in the Guardian and the BBC and on the New York Times. You know, Eric Youngstrom, disgraced psychologist, presents himself as a psychic. And I wanted to say Eric Youngstrom is a psychic, I would probably have to cite one of those external sources as the reference for that.
So I've done something that's probably less controversial than that, but I want your opinion. So I've just added one of Eric's students, not me. I'm going to add me next. I've added Mian Leong, who as doctoral student of Eric Youngstrom, using the lab webpage as the official website as the source. And then I had to go and add Mian's sex or gender because he existed because he has an ORCID ID. And so I'm wondering if that whole adventure was kosher.
Yeah, so some interesting parts in that. Let's kind of go backwards through it. So the first one was Mian's sex or gender.
Yes.
The reference for that is going to have to be another based on heuristic inferred from name, unless there's been something where Mian has stated preferred pronouns or
yeah.
Oh, cool. Well, in that case, I mean, if there's somewhere where Mian has publicly stated preferred pronouns, you can actually cite that as the sex or gender. I think for Eric, we have again, Eric, male, 0 references. So this is currently unreferenced. I'm just going to, as our placeholder for the moment, say based on heuristic inferred from name. From first name. I can't remember exactly what the inferred from option is for this one. Oh, deduced from patronymic name. Okay, that's the one. It's...
That's cool.
I don't even know what that means.
Actually, no, patron. It's not the patronymic name, is it?
No, surname.
Yeah, deduced from full name is deduced from given name. Thank you. That's the one. So I'm going to publish that, and I'm also actually going to quickly again go over to that deduced from given name. So this concept of deduction, inferred from given name, that should have come up as when I was typing it. Maybe I was misspelling name again, but I'm just going to also say sometimes people mean that. Some people mean first name is probably what some people will mean. So there's some different aliases that people might be using when searching from that. Anyway,
so what
again,
you just did was upgraded that item, that modifier.
Yeah.
Sorry to so on the based on heuristic, you typed in deduced from given name. And when I'm trying to do that on Mian's page, I click in the box and it says it gives me options for genders. I'm confused.
Yep. So this is the 2 separate bits. So this is the statement that we're adding, which is when I'm editing the statement. And then what I did was I also added a reference, which was based on this heuristic.
Yeah, when I click on that box, it gives me options for genders. So I can just write deduced from given or.
Yeah, that should be right. So it should be when in the references section, the property will be based on heuristic and the value will be deduced from given name.
Got it. Thank you.
So when I look where you put child psychology under field of work, there's like a little lightning bolt arrow, and when I click on it, it says issues, property, scope, constraint.
Interesting. So let's see what this scope is. This property URL should not be used as a oh my gosh, how embarrassing. I've actually messed this up. So here's what I meant to do. So here's the reference URL. Here's a reference URL. This lightning bolt has said, you've screwed this up, Thomas. You haven't put this in the references section. You did this in the qualifiers. So if I was going to say child psychology, of children or of mood disorders, for example, or with the start time of this particular date, this is where I'd put it. In fact, I've put that reference in the wrong place. I was meant to put it in this add reference section here, reference URL.
Can you cite a Twitter for if he put his in his Twitter bio?
Yeah, I reckon for sex or gender, that is a sufficient reference to point to.
I'm going to send you the link of his where he says his in his bio.
And particularly if we have the Twitter account linked to that person. So Eric, you have a Twitter account, don't you?
Barely.
Yeah.
So Eric has just started up a Twitter. So the Twitter username will be whatever Eric's username is.
Oh, okay. So Mian's is.
Just do a quick search. So at Eric Youngstrom, all one word.
That's the wrong one.
Wrong one.
It's the one right before that. It's like Eric A. Youngstrom, I think.
Eric A. Youngstrom. Ah, the other Eric Youngstrom is an imposter. So
Yeah.
Erica Youngstrom is this one. So all right, publish. It's also going to suggest some other points. So it's going to flag this and say, hey, by the way, you've added a Twitter username. You should also add a start time. Hey, you've added this. You should add the Twitter numeric ID, whatever that is. I don't really know enough about Twitter to know how to find the numeric ID. I can put the joined May 2014. So, okay, we can do that for Eric. Edit, add the qualifier of the start time. Oops, May 2014. Lovely. All right, so then particularly if I'm then adding information up here about, oh, yep, sex or gender is stated as part of this statement here, then I would just be able to link back to it. And I might even want to put a specific, for something like that where it might change, or that summary might be changed at a later time. I might want to specifically say in the reference that it was based on this particular source, and I'm just going to click edit here. And I'm going to say another thing about this was point in time on this particular date. So I can say that it was retrieved from this reference, and I'm specifically talking about this reference on this day.
When adding qualifiers, is there like a database that you can use? Like if you're looking for a specific qualifier and if you can't find it, is there a way to like create a new one?
Yeah, so qualifiers can be created in the same way that items can, but qualifiers are a much more controlled language. So even though there are 100 million items, there are only a few thousand qualifiers, and there's much more care taken in making sure that we don't make like multiple different versions of the same qualifier. So there is the same process for doing that. There are good lists of qualifiers that you can find. If I go through, I think Community Portal is going to be the easiest way to go to it. But there's different wiki projects that will curate the sets of qualifiers that are most commonly, the sets of properties and sets of qualifiers that are most commonly used. So firstly, there'll be a biographies one. But actually, I'm going to go to the, we'll do biographies first, actually, biograph. Search in the hierarchy. Oops, nope, apparently it's not what I thought it was. Biographical identifiers. So there'll be lists, these various different wiki projects will have lists of common properties that they're expecting lots of people will use. I'll also go to source metadata. Yeah, there we go. Within the source metadata one, there's also a nice list of additional properties that might be useful. So they'll usually have a box that looks something like this, and it'll be organized up. For example, scholarly articles are likely to have all sorts of data about them, like the author and the genre and the subtitle and the volume and the copyright holder. All this sorts of information is retracted for retracted articles. They also might have these other identifiers linking to other sites, so like a PubMed ID or a DOI or an archive ID. And similarly, scholarly journals might have these sorts of items, proceedings might have these sorts of items. supplementary data, theses. So again, we were doing a thesis as our initial, we were doing a thesis as our initial one. And so already it's giving us the examples that like authors, titles, languages, main subjects, full work available at, and submitted to are the ones that it's most expecting, but there's some other items that it might that might be useful. And again, down here in the authors section, there are some suggested properties that you might be expecting to have associated with authors. When we're talking about the properties for those statements, so for example, when I was back with Eric Youngstrom, not Eric Young, sorry.
Not me.
Eric Youngstrom, the American psychologist. Yeah, when I'm here and I'm thinking about putting in qualifiers, it'll often have suggested ones when I start typing it in. So for example, when we say employer, it'll probably, and I say add qualifier, it'll give some suggested ones like start and end time. But there's it's quite tricky to know the full possible list of other qualifiers you can use. The easiest way is usually to look at an example of a really in-depth, already written up one. So again, in all of these, they'll usually have example items here, and you can, so for example, for some theses, we might be able to look at this one, I think, is a thesis. So it's possible to then look at various like example items that are meant to be as detailed as possible, and the same will likely be true of bibliography information. So yeah, core metadata for people, these are the sorts of things we're expecting. These are the ones required. All people should be instance of a human. This is the useful basic information like image, sex or gender, country of citizenship, occupation, blah, 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 and relationships with others, if those others are also on Wikidata. And then it'll have loads more information here about other sorts of things that can come up. And I'm pretty sure that there are a few sort of really in-depth examples listed down here.
So with a little bit less than 10 minutes left, what I'd like to ask the HGAPS people to do is you play with this more, let's gather a list of examples. So to Thomas's point about having a well-developed example to work from to see what are the other fields, what are the other modifiers. So I dropped into the chat an example of if you were looking at information about a person. There's a very, very detailed, well worked out example of a person. The exact link that I dropped in is for a query engine called Scholia that but Q383-82414 is a very detailed person. But we could do the same thing with a detailed article or a detailed topic. So let's build a cheat sheet or a list of examples. Lizzie asked a question, which is sort of if people in HGAPS continue to do this, what are some of the ways of having the most impact? Should we be adding more articles from Crossref or Zotero databases? Should we be concentrating on articles, and how much of this is automated?
I think that there are probably three main areas, which is individuals and organizations as one area, articles and sort of published information as another, and the last one, which is going to be the most difficult, is the concepts and relationships between those concepts. So for example, if I search in Wikidata for countertransference. Countertransference is this one, the psychoanalytical theory. It's actually relatively minimally fleshed out, right? So we've got Quora topics, we've got JSTOR topics, we've got the mesh descriptor, which is good, Library of Congress ID, excellent, and we've got instance of and subclass of for psychoanalytic theory, and it's a subclass of transference. Transference itself is a subclass of psychological projection and is part of psychological terminology, but apparently this one isn't part of psychological terminology. This is a psychoanalytic theory, but transference isn't a psychoanalytic theory. It's a subclass of psychological projection. And when I go to psychological projection, let's see what that's an instance of a concept. It's an instance of a cognitive bias. It's an instance of a defense mechanism. It's part of psychological terminology. So is this the best way to describe that information? I don't know. It's not my area. But if I were to do something more within my area, let's say phylogenetics, I think phylogenetics is already more well described. So again, phylogenetics is a branch of science, but it's got a quality. It specifically states what this field studies. So the field of phylogenetics studies phylogenesis and evolution. And it's got a lot more sort of different aspects of its information alongside that. So there's kind of other pieces of information that could definitely be usefully linked up within the corpus. And also, none of this has any references. So if I want to argue with, well, really, is phylogenetics, does it really study phylogenesis? There's no reference that actually supports that. And I suspect that the same thing is going to be true of all of this information in countertransference. Yep, there's no reference that tells me that countertransference is a subclass of transference. So those are some of the things that definitely need a lot of improvement.
You said concepts, organizations, and what was the first one?
Individuals.
And different than, so Wikipedia, living people are hard to touch, but but Wikidata, it's all good.
Yeah, Wikidata is much easier to touch, and that is particularly because the information is a lot less contentious and there's a lot less room for editorializing or interpretation, particularly with that kind of metadata about people. It's all very I think it's very clear cut, whereas relationships between concepts, that's a lot more tricky. So for, again, like I'm talking here, we're talking about promoters as in the region of DNA that initiates transcription of a gene. It is part of a gene, and there are two references that state that it's part of a gene. It's a subclass of a regulatory sequence, and again, we've got a reference that supports that as well. So by putting together more references for this sort of information, it's a lot more useful. And this is particularly visible in drug information versus non-pharmaceutical interventions. So I'm going to search for, I don't know, Valium. Let's go for something, yep, diazepam. I suspect we're going to have lots of information on that. Yep, it's an instance of all of these different things. It's an essential medicine, It's a subclass of benzodiazepines. It's part of diazepine binding, and it has this role of reactant. We've got its chemical structure, we've got its mass, we've got its chemical formula. It's the active ingredient in Valium and Diastat, and we've got references for both of those. Excellent. It's used in the treatment of all these medical conditions, and we've got references for all of those medical conditions that it's used in the treatment of. Physically interacts with all of these different receptors. Route of administration, you can take it any way you like. There's all sorts of information for this particular pharmaceutical intervention. And now let's look at cognitive behavioral therapy. And I'm going to, I suspect.
Do we have one for insomnia? That would be the most direct comparison.
Oh, interesting. For what, sorry?
CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia.
Do we have specifically CBTI?
No,
We
that's
have the
gene.
no, we have the clinical trial about CBTI, and then we have other things that are
Yep.
related to it. Let's see if CBT for insomnia. No, we've got some scientific articles related to it, but we don't have an item for the concept itself. And within the CBT article, within the CBT item, it's different from cognitive therapy. We've got a schematic for it. The end, I mean, we've got its mesh identifiers and, you know, useful things down here, but no information about who developed it, when was it invented, what's it used in the treatment of, does it have, are there any contraindications for it, does it have any interactions? I know that there was some information about meditation, where I think for extreme, for severe depression, some meditative therapies end up being counterproductive. And so, you know, you might consider putting in information about contraindications for non-pharmaceutical interventions. But you can see how that item on diazepam is vastly more detailed than the item on CBT, let alone, and CBT is probably the best described.
In another
item.
window, real fast, do a Google search for diazepam and CBT so that they can see the implication of this on the knowledge panel.
So here's diazepam as a Google search, and again, knowledge panel, we're straight up getting information pulled straight out of this statement here is from Wikipedia. That's the first sentence of the Wikipedia article, and then all of this information here is pulled out of Wikidata. And
when I got this far with my daughter and my dad, my daughter is gearing up for pharmacy, and my dad has spent his entire career as a research chemist in pharma, and they were looking at the knowledge panel and the references in the Wikidata, and they're like, oh yeah, that's an open database, that's an open database, that's an open database. So the problem again for us in psychology is our best databases aren't open, and and so it's a very poor snapshot of what we have to offer that's discoverable.
So I'm going to do an example now, just to link this all back into wiki journals, and I'm just going to show let's look at articles that are currently in review as well as articles that are published. So all of this page is being built from Wikidata because these each have a Wikidata item. And when I go to the article itself, can each number be specified by a finite text? All of the metadata about this article is also being stored on Wikidata. So the DOI, this QID, the metadata item is stored there. The authors, their email address, the fact that they are deceased is stored on Wikidata. The editors for this article, Jonathan Holland and Henry Hoff, stored on Wikidata. The peer reviewers, these peer reviewers, stored on Wikidata. Here are their peer reviewer comments, which are stored on the talk page of this article, and that URL for where those peer reviewer comments can be found, also indicated on Wikidata. If I go through to the Wikidata item, it's going to link back to a lot of this, but you can see here, can each number be specified by a finite text? Instance of a scholarly article. Here's that, here's the abstract image. Here are the main subjects. Again, the author, Boris Cyrilson. Here are the peer reviewers and the times they did it. Here are the editors and their specific roles. In this case, it had 2 handling editors, but if it had a statistical reviewer, we would have said that it had a separate statistical reviewer. Language English, publication date, blah, 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 blah. We've got the submission dates for articles that are then integrated into Wikipedia. We also have the date of integration into Wikipedia. For articles that were submitted from a preprint server, we would also say that it was submitted from bioRxiv or submitted from Wikipedia. Kind of basic information like the publisher and the DOI. And again, we have all of the, it's really easy to then move backwards and forwards between all of this information. So we can look at Boris Cyrilson and all of the articles they've authored, but we could also look at Mikhail Sodin and look at all of the articles that they've peer reviewed. And so again, building up that open network. And in fact, when we look at the potential upcoming articles, this table is also populated from Wikidata. So we can see articles here that are still going through the process. This one is just finished. It was submitted on this particular day. It's had a DOI assigned. It's had a PDF for it prepared. It's been integrated into Wikipedia, and we know the editors and the reviewers. And in this case, it's got one anonymous reviewer and one named reviewer. But for other items, we can see that here's one where we have associated editors and we've only had one reviewer respond so far. And so, of course, it hasn't been accepted for publication, which is why it doesn't have a DOI yet. And of course, it wouldn't have a PDF created for it. So all of the processing and handling of articles is also integrated into with Wikidata. The editors are, we're currently in the process of having all of this editorial information drawn directly from Wikidata. The same thing is true for, if I were to go to phage therapy is one of the articles that's currently going through peer review in for Wiki Journal of Medicine. And again, all of those reviewers linked into Wikidata, linked into Wikidata, linked into Wikidata. So again, this information is once again being drawn back out of Wikidata.
I've been on the journal for more than a year now, and I hadn't understood that part of it.
This has only been true for the last couple of weeks. So this is the level of integration with Wikidata is increasing at a reasonably rapid pace.
How many editors are there across the three journals?
I can find that out. Well, I can find that out in a couple of ways, but let's just look up the actual Wiki Journal user group.
Need a U in journal?
Yeah, usually. That's the old-fashioned way of spelling it.
It's French.
And probably with fewer R's.
You make me feel so much better.
Oh gosh,